Carmen.
10 minutes. That's not too much for. Yes, well, let's start. We'd like to welcome Professor Milford Bateman. He's here on this Erasmus Plus Mobility program. That's a new program that UFI, our PhD program, is starting with the University of Pula. So, and our expectation that this program can be continued and more interchange of academics can occur. And we thank you very much your presence, your disponibility to be here. And so I'll let you
thank you very much.
make more presentation. But what I was planning was that we start with a seminar and then we have a debate on the seminar. And afterwards, we could advance something about what people are doing for their research, and then we can work that on that, on further meetings with Professor.
I'm around for a few days, for quite a while.
Because the idea is that we build a research agenda, and that will be the base for the continuation of our program, I guess. So it's important to get the feedback of people working on and how
The journal group. He's member of the Finde.
Yes, of course. I think people have already noticed, but he's the part of our group. He joined our group. So we are really international. That's for real. So thank you very much. So please.
Okay, thank you. It's really great to be here. I've been to Brazil a couple of times and known Finde and Carmen for a while, so it was really pleased when we managed to make a link between my sort of home university in Croatia and UF, and we managed to organise this transfer. It's a 3-year programme, so there'll be some various exchanges of staff and occasionally some students. So I'm very glad to be here on that foundation. What I'm going to talk about today is some work that I've been doing. Really, I've done a lot of work on finance over the last few years, but my PhD and a lot of my consulting work, when I left academic life and went in to be a consultant, because I didn't just want to teach, I wanted to do, I was working on local economic development. Then I moved back into an academic context and focused almost accidentally on finance. But this is part of work that I'm starting next year with. I've got a book. I've been offered a book contract with Routledge to do a book entitled The Local Origins of National Economic Success. So it's a book about why the local has been very important for national success, but it often gets overlooked. So people don't realise that in many examples of national economic success, it wasn't so much that the central government was the key architect. When you actually look at the example, you find that it was actually very much a bottom-up rather than a top-down example. So that's really what I'm planning to start next year, and this is part of it. I'm starting to look more and more. And the reason I'm looking at China is not just that it is one of the best examples, but I was also, as part of my consulting work, I was out in China in the early 2000s on a project where we were advising the national government on local development, and I was team leader on that project. It was a very strange project because it was about giving British expertise to China at a time when Britain was really struggling and China was absolutely booming. So it was really rather strange that we were going to, for example, business incubators in Shenzhen, which were beautiful skyscrapers with each floor a particular subject, well funded. And when I remember the business incubator back at one of the universities I used to teach in a town called Wolverhampton, it literally was just an old building that they painted up, and they had a few rooms where people could go in and set up a business. And so I thought, that's an incubator in Wolverhampton, which is really nothing, and that is an incubator. So I thought, we can't really teach them anything. But I always had an interest in what they were doing, and I followed it up over the years. So really, that's what I want to talk about today. Now, one thing is, you don't need to copy anything from the slides, because we'll have your emails, and Fernando will have the copy of the slides, and you'll get the slides. So write just notes or anything, but you don't need to copy them down, because you'll have a copy. Because I do make them quite dense at times. So really what I want to look at is to share my observations of China and how it has magnificently developed from one of the 5 poorest countries in the world in 1970, alongside, I think, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, I mean, some really very, very poor countries, to where it is today and where it's going. I want to look at the theory and the practice of what we call the local developmental state model, the LDS model. I want to look at the foundations in China, where this model came from, look at the rise in particular of what we call the township and village enterprise movement, which was really fundamental to China's success. I want to look also at the way that Chinese policymakers were really buffeted by international developments. So in one period of time, they were very heterodox, anti-neoliberal, and then at other times they started to imbibe a lot of neoliberal policies back home, partly because they were sending off their students to places like Harvard and Princeton and LSE, who were coming back and saying, you don't need to do it that way. The textbooks tell us that we can do it much better this way. And then there were problems. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk a little bit about the way that the township then graduated. It became the city was the real engine in China. And the latest is the dangerous flirtations with financialization and fintech, financial technology. I'm sure you've heard of the Golden Triangle, Hangzhou, Shenzhen, Shanghai, where everything in terms of financial technology is being developed there. It's an astonishing place, but there are huge problems, as the Chinese are now finding with that. And then a quick final reckoning. So do stop me at any time if there's any questions or anything you're not clear about, or if I'm going too fast, because I sometimes talk too fast. So, first part, the theory and practice. Well, the whole idea that local government could be behind development really started in the 19th century. Now, before that, it was very much an Adam Smithian world, where markets were autonomous and leave the economy alone, and the individual motivations of business people somehow would coordinate, and that would drive forward the economy. The idea that government had a role to play was really not really talked about in the 1840s and 1850s with the influence of Adam Smith. But then in the 1850s, in the north of England, we started to have what we call a lot of industrial districts. Now, these were cities where Alfred Marshall, after Smith, it became Marshallian economics, and Marshall talked about the way that he found in cities like Leeds and Bradford and Manchester, lots of businesses in these towns working together, cooperating, and working in conjunction with the local government in terms of training, financing, providing technology, innovation, and it became very much an interlinked model of an industrial district. So that was the first inkling, the first suggestion that we had a new model away from Adam Smith's pure, it's all about individuals competing on this thing called the market. This was the first inkling, the idea that something was actually changing, and Marshall was the first to look at this. We then looked and found in Germany, Belgium, Austria, France, and northern Italy, similar types of industrial districts were starting to emerge at the end of the 1800s. Again, with local, proactive, local governments doing things in the locality to support businesses and to drive them in a particular direction, okay? In a more productive direction, adding value, giving technology, helping to export. So we started to realise that the industrial district model wasn't just something in the UK, in the north of England. I'm from the north of England, and I even remember at school going to places like Leeds and Bradford and looking at all the technical institutes set up by the local government, the workers' training institutes set up with local entrepreneurs in the local government, the first colleges of education and engineering, cooperative banks set up with the support of local government to help the industries, mainly textiles, engineering, in that part of the world. So this was certainly something I saw when I was a kid, that if you like, the remains of what they started in the 1850s. Another good example of what we might call a local developmental state is Red Vienna. In the early 1900s, Vienna was a real lefty city governed by a very socialist administration, doing lots of things in the local economy to help businesses and to make life a lot better in terms of minimum wage legislation, training of workers, providing housing for workers, and it became such a success that other cities were looking to this model of Red Vienna. Unfortunately, it got washed away in the 1930s by something called fascism, but it serves as a historical example of what's possible. So the dominant development model in Europe was still in many parts a top-down model involving central government working to create big industries. But we started to see the bones of an alternative development model in those regions. So these models, these practical realities, gave rise to theories. How to explain what was going on in Manchester and Leeds and then parts of Germany and France. So the theory followed the practice. And it became clear that these local institutions, local state institutions in particular, were all about circulating knowledge, how to run these machines, how to make them better, how to improve them. That was circulated through training institutes, workers' educational associations, technology institutes set up by local government. People learned the tacit knowledge, learned from each other about how things worked in other factories. People would move from one factory to another. Local financial institutions started to emerge, again set up, to the point where, in Italy, example, Beccattini famously called it the theory of the local bank. Local banks were embedded in the community. They knew entrepreneurs, they knew the companies, they knew how to help them, and they knew when not to help them if they thought these businesses were not doing very well. This was the start of what we call relationship banking, that you have a relationship between the giver of cash and the recipient of cash, and it's a mutual cooperative relationship. I provide the money, I want to help you to make our community more powerful, and you want to get money from me, you want to do the same thing, and we work together. It's quite a difference to the sort of financial models we have today, where it's about, I'm going to give you money, but I need to make maximum profit out of our relationship, and I will screw you as much as I can.
What's the period?
Sorry?
When was that?
For that, well, that would have been in the sort of late 1800s, when we had a lot of cooperative banks setting up in various places, and also local municipal banks.
But did they have national banks as well?
They did in some of the countries, but I mean, certainly in the UK there was no real national bank at the time. We had big merchant banks, but that was funding the empire.
Okay.
Wasn't really
That's
funding
what was
industry.
going to,
Yeah, you know, they were into the trade.
So basically the industry was funded by local government.
Institutions founded or supported or regulated tightly by local governments, in that they were providing finance to businesses with a purpose, and that purpose was development. It wasn't simply about making tons of money. There was a sense of cooperation in those periods, which of course, when you move to the present day, there's no real cooperation in many countries, because I'm trying to screw you and you're trying to screw me, and I want to make money off you. Nobody has a sense of, we're all in this together, we're going to help each other. Okay, that sort of cooperative ethos we've lost since around 1980 for reasons I'm sure you're aware of. So local other institutions are what we call embedded, they were part of the community. They wanted to see the community grow, the local economy grow, so we called them embedded. And they were responsive to problems. They could see where there were bottlenecks. Maybe a big company didn't have a supplier of a particular good. They would help people to set up companies to supply the big companies. So a very proactive way of doing things. And of course these local institutions can start to plan a little bit for local development. If we don't know where we're going, it's very much less likely that we're going to get there. If we don't have some idea, are we going to develop an economy based on textiles, or should we diversify? Can we bring in engineering? Do we need to export more? All of these things are something that some sort of body can decide, look, we're going to try and help to move the economy in a more sustainable direction, rather than just leave it to jungle law of the market and whatever happens, happens. We could collapse or we could benefit, but we don't know. And of course, local institutions also understand something called externalities. Those are things not within the company, but within the community. Okay? So you do something and you help one particular company train its workers. Well, it's good for the overall community because those workers will change jobs, go to the other companies, but they'll take their knowledge and their experience with them. So you provide, companies don't generally price those things in, but a local government can do those things, can maximize the externalities of whatever it is that it does in the community. Now, the local developmental state model then started to boom after the Second World War. Part of the reason for that was that we had, in some countries, a very successful state strategy to win the war, in particular the US and the UK. I mean, they called it at the time war communism. So we planned munitions and food and everything in order to do, the overall battle was to win the war, and we maximized, we coordinated everything for that simple goal of winning the war. Okay? So the whole idea of the state took on a new meaning. It became quite a positive thing. It was actually there to help people. It was run by people in democracies, and it was there to actually help and support and move the economy in a more sustainable direction. But what was funny is that it was the defeated economies in Europe that really took on the local developmental state more than the winning economies. In the UK, we've never really given local government a role in economic development. It's always been very London-centred task. Whereas in countries like Germany and France and Italy, partly because of the politics, fascism came to these countries because they had a very, very strong central government with a big figure trying to rule everything. And they thought after the war, the only way to make sure we never have fascism again is to decentralise and give all the cities a little bit of power in order that we don't have one big dictator taking over again. So it was partly political that they decentralised. But the outcome of that was very good from economic development terms, because cities and regions took up this responsibility very well and started to do a lot of good things. And we had this new idea of inclusive development. Now, I know this word inclusion is bandied around in everything is inclusive nowadays. But in those days, they said, look, part of the reason we had fascism was because of the exploitation and the inequality that existed, and people were angry. The popular movements were angry because it was really bad that we had so much exploitation and inequality, and the elites felt threatened. And when somebody, some demagogue came along and said, I will protect you, then they rushed to the demagogue, and then everything broke down under fascism. So making everybody benefit from the reconstruction was very much the goal of the government in Germany, well, West Germany, France, Italy, Austria, those countries. So just very quickly, some of the best models, and you can certainly read about these. Northern Italy is a particular interest of mine because we live very close to the Italian border, and we go across to Northern Italy, and I've done a lot of study tours there with policymakers from the Balkans. And it's a fantastic experiment that they've had there since 1945, particularly in Red Emilia or Romana, which is probably the most successful of the localities. That was dirt poor in 1945, and probably Europe's richest region, even including Switzerland. It's one of the richest regions in Italy. And this was in spite of opposition from the central government, because they were Christian Democrats, and these guys in Emilia-Romagna were socialist communists or whatever. They were leftists. And also the US government refused to give Marshall Plan funding to the north for the political reasons as well. But in spite of that, they developed their model, very much driven by local governments, by city governments, by new regional administrations, elected administrations, and they certainly succeeded. Similar success came in the northern Spanish region, the Basque region. It was initially based on the town of Mondragon, but it was a cooperative development model. So the Madrid government hated the Basques at the time. There'd been lots of problems, civil war. And so the Basques realized, at least in the town of Mondragon, if we don't do something ourselves, we will never develop. So they set up various institutions, but non-governmental institutions initially. It became a success, and then the regional government looked at this and said, well, that's a fantastic success. We'll take those institutions but make them state institutions. Okay? So the development bank became a state development bank. The entrepreneurship development company became a state company. So they looked at the architecture they created in Mondragon to make it the most successful region in Spain for a time, and then transplanted it all over the Basque region. The Basque region was one of the poorest. It's now the richest region by far in Spain. So very successful. Former West Germany as well. Okay? The Länder, the regional governments were very powerful. Local city governments, lots of things. It's been called Standortpolitik, the strategic management of place. Okay? In other words, local governments making, coordinating, doing things locally, being proactive to support the existing economy, to support diversification, to support innovation, and it somehow worked. West Germany was destroyed in 1945. By the 1990s, it was way ahead of the UK, and today, of course, living standards probably double what they are in the UK. Well, it's partly because the UK is going down for reasons we don't need to go into, and I'm sure you're familiar with them. So that was very interesting the way they did it. Also, Norway had the same oil and gas find as the UK. In fact, they had 40%, the UK had 60%. We took a very market-driven model and said, leave it to the private sector. They know how to exploit the oil and gas. Norway said, no, that's our chance to move away from shipbuilding and canning fish. Okay? Poor country. And they started to use the oil windfall, developed the institutions at the local and regional level to maximize the value, diversify out of oil and gas eventually, and of course Norway is the world's richest, probably the world's richest economy, if you exclude the Gulf states, which are a bit strange. And of course you can compare that to the non-state, the non-interventionist model of the UK. At the end, we won't even know we had oil and gas. The money has gone. There's no real impact on the Grampian region, and certainly not at the national level. We are not into any new technologies. We're not at the cutting edge of anything new. There was no innovation. Basically, the oil and gas revenue paid for unemployment under Mrs. Thatcher. Then, of course, we talk about East Asia's developmental states. That's where the term developmental state came from, starting with Japan and then South Korea and then Taiwan. Lots and lots of stuff written on that. But all about really the top down. How the Japanese MITI, the famous Ministry of International Trade and Industry, planned things from the top down. South Korea did the same. Taiwan's a special case because it's a region of China, but it's a country. But all this literature that emerged out of that was all about the top down, whereas when you actually do go into the data and look, a lot of it is actually bottom up impetus. Japan, for example, had a lot of things going on at the municipality level. supporting the subcontractors to the big businesses. They set up all the financial institutions. They established public technology centres which passed around all the technologies and innovations from the bottom up. They supported new businesses which they thought, well, we want you to become big in the future for a particular technology reason, but you'll not get started now if you don't have any contracts. Somebody has to take the risk. Private sector buyers won't buy your product, so the state will. So they would give them starter orders to build capacity, to let them learn by doing. Okay? And that's how the Japanese got to dominate solar, and got to dominate wind, and got to dominate robotics, and a lot of other areas where they had a lot of innovation potential, but nobody would buy things because it was too risky. So the state, the local state, bought those things, and now Japan leads in so many areas. I think China has taken over in solar and wind powers, we'll come on to, but for the same reasons. South Korea did the same, food self-security, and then moving on to innovating, providing the support to the small and medium enterprises, which linked in with the Kaibol. Taiwan, again, food self-sufficiency, and then they developed the world's most impressive technology transfer local structures, which turned Taiwan from a very poor province of China into a country, whatever, which is now at the cutting edge in so many areas of technology. That was the first wave, or second wave if you count Japan on its own. And then the third wave, we had Malaysia, Indonesia, Taiwan, Indonesia. Same lessons, working at the local level to develop a bottom-up impetus. New technologies, we had flexible technologies which gave a real impetus to local development, because the initial model, industrialization model, was all about big steel companies, big concrete companies, big companies, and that's why you needed central government, because they had the muscle to help these big companies. Okay? But in the 1970s, technologies changed. People like Pure and Sable talked about flexible specialization. We don't talk about it much now because there's lots of other models. But technologies have advanced so that you can actually gain economies of scale by small amounts of production. You don't need a giant factory to produce things so that the cost per unit is low. Because with these new technologies, you can produce something and press a few buttons, and then the machines you're working on will change to a different thing, a different product, and you can produce that. So that clearly changed the whole way of producing things, and meant that small businesses were now as efficient as big businesses. So that meant that we read the way that countries developed was less about big companies and more about small and medium enterprises. So there was a change. And of course, local government is much better situated to support small businesses than it is to support big businesses. So that was very good. So the local state came back in, and then in a much better position. Mainstream neoclassical economists started to get worried about this. They could see that the state was coming in. This was moving them away from their neoclassical roots, where the state is usually a barrier to development. So they would very often misrepresent, fake news, whatever you want to call it. The most famous example is a great article by Robert Wade, where the World Bank, the Japanese insisted that the World Bank has to do a study on the Japanese model. Okay? In spite of the Americans refusing it because they didn't want to know what was there, they didn't want to open the box. But the Japanese said, no, you cannot. Countries that are developing, particularly Eastern Europe, is moving towards the market. They must learn from the Japanese experience. So eventually the World Bank caved in and said, okay, we'll have a study on Japan's post-war success. But if you read Robert Wade's article, the way they did it was totally unethical. For example, leaving out all the world's top specialists on the developmental state. So people like Wade and Amsden, Hajun Chang, Sanjay Lal, the real experts were just not even involved. Okay? And then there was a way of manipulating everything so that at the end of the day, the state wasn't as, the state only did what the market would have done without the state. So really we didn't need the state. And it's very, funny, Robert Wade's article, because he was part of the process, the way they misrepresented Japan's success. The Japanese were not very happy with it, but they weren't as powerful. So their message, particularly to Eastern Europe, was ignored. And Eastern Europe went down a very neoliberal way. And the same thing happens at the local level. I've seen this myself. I did a spot of work. I was based at the OCDE in Paris for a while, which was a very neoliberal institution. So, and then as a consultant afterwards, I could see how when we were writing reports, we were always told and instructed and threatened that if we didn't evaluate projects through a market lens, that it wouldn't get published, or we wouldn't get paid, or something like that. So if you saw something, you said, well, actually, this is a very good example of where the state intervened and created a good output, you could never say that. They would just cross it out, and they would put it, this is a good example where the state stood back and allowed the private sector to do what it does best. So it's a very strange,
How threatened?
Sorry?
How threatened were you? Like how? What would you?
Well, I managed a year in the OECD,
Yeah.
and the reason, and that was it. Then I wasn't going to get another contract there. I can tell you very clearly what happened. We were doing. So I was working on. I was the advisor on the Balkans, and the idea was that we would. Somebody came up with the idea that each country we should do an evaluation of their policy. So we got the EBRD in London, the World Bank, and the OECD, and I was in charge. We hired a minibus, and we went to Macedonia. And so we would go from city to city to meet ministers, local mayors, economists, and then it had to be demand-led. So we had to take their observations and their what they think we needed to do on board and write a report of what we needed to do. So we went around Macedonia in this minibus, and we heard from lots of people. The Minister of Finance said we need a state development bank. I mean, that we aren't, our banks are not supporting any businesses, they're only supporting the foreign exchange system and imports of luxury goods. So nobody's supporting, so we need a development bank. We heard that quite a few times. Others said we need all sorts of things like, we need technology transfer. I'd been to Japan, I saw how they do, we need that here. So we went round and we were all in the room together, but I had to write the report. So I just put all this information together and wrote it down, and it looked quite an interventionist type of report. But I thought, they can't complain because they heard it as well. So this thing, it blew completely, absolutely. Call from the EBRD, are you crazy? We are trying to take the state out of everything in Eastern Europe, and you're saying it actually has a role to play. We are pulling out, this cannot work. So then the boss calls me in, you have to rewrite that. There's no way. You have to rewrite. Well, how can I rewrite it in what way? And then the next day I was taken off the project. So the woman at the EBRD wrote the whole thing, and it was completely trash.
Was she there at least?
Sorry?
Was she there with you?
She was on the trip as well, yes. Her ex-husband is a Nobel Prize winner, Miss Reedy's. She was on the trip with me, but she wrote it as though none of us had been there. And so clearly my future at the OECD was not going to happen. But what really upset me was that I worked in Macedonia a lot, and I had a lot of friends there who said, look, Milford, we're sick of everybody coming around and listening, and we say this and then they go and write something. I said, well, look, as far as I'm writing a report, so you tell us what we need to do, and I pretty much agree with you, and we'll do this. So when the report came out and they saw this, we got in touch, and they said, Milford, what is this? We need to invite Santander and Barclays to do our financial system. That's not what we said. No, I know. I'm off it. I'm literally off that project. And at one stage, I was sat in a room at the end of a corridor just to see out my contract, because they couldn't put me, they couldn't give me anything to do. And so they were upset because what they had said to us was just ignored. And so the country assessment report for Macedonia was something that was not written at all, although it said at the start with consultation with Macedonia inside. Bullshit. None of them had what they said, never went in. So that's one example.
Do they have a development bank now?
They eventually ended up with one called the Macedonian Bank for Development Promotion, but it was basically a commercial bank. It got money from the donors and then just on-lent it to commercial banks with a 2% charge. And they did nothing, and they just let the commercial banks do what they want. Terrible. So, building the foundations in China. So in the 1970s, Deng Xiaoping comes along, central planning is collapsing, and China's in trouble. They need something. He gets into power, and he said, look, we are sick of China being backward. We had the Cultural Revolution, which was a disaster. We had famine. We've got to try something new. And so Deng Xiaoping decides we've got to dismantle central planning. So that's it. Central planning was dismantled, and Deng said, look, politics will stay in Beijing, we'll control the international, but we're going to give development responsibility down to subnational government. So this was a huge change. China was always a centralized country under the emperors, but he said, no, we're going to devolve because we don't know how to do it, but we'll give it to cities. So they started on that. They had the household responsibility system where they gave 40-year leases to families to farm land and grow whatever you want. Some of it would be bought by the state, but the rest you could sell on the market. So China started to develop a lot of subnational policies. Cities, townships, villages became more important, and they learned from the first Asian tigers. They didn't like to say it, but they learned a lot from Japan. Even more, they didn't like to say they learned from Taiwan. In fact, in academic articles, you were never allowed to refer to the word Taiwan. Okay, so they would call it in code. It became Hungary. So you'd have these strange articles where Hungary did this and Hungary that's not, and that was actually really Taiwan. But that was the only way you could refer to the Taiwanese model by this mythical country called Hungary. It was very strange. It took me a long while to understand what was going on. And they developed a very institution-fit model, and they realized that they always had a powerful bureaucracy, a competent bureaucracy, and local institutions were upgraded in terms of the personnel, good salaries, prestige, competent, most people got there. And it was actually in China's model that it was coined the local developmental state, because everything was coming from the bottom. Chinese academics call it the Sunan model because of the region where it was most powerful in southern China, but Westerners call it the local development model. So what was the main thing at the start was something called the Township and Village Enterprise. So this was a new enterprise, and it was owned by local government, but it was quite similar to a private enterprise in the sense that it was a profit-seeking business. It was subject to hard budget constraints, so it wasn't just subsidised all the time. It operated according to very strict performance targets. It was given the best production technologies. I mean, that's the key thing. They weren't just primitive technologies. They would buy the very latest, even if that meant foreign technologies. And they were incorporated into local development plans. So these new township and village enterprises started in the early 80s to grow in the southern provinces, and they began to develop and grow and promote the local economy. There was a big feedback. For example, most of the profits of these companies were reinvested in new technologies. So they weren't given out to shareholders or private owners or foreign owners. They were recycled back. Okay? They contributed to the local tax base. Now, taxation is a problem in Latin America, but it certainly was in China. Private businesses don't generally, they always have two sets of books. One book's for the taxman, one book's for the real world, okay? But these businesses were owned by local governments, so of course they're not going to not pay tax. And in fact, when you go to Chinese TVEs, the remaining ones that were there, or even today, you see plaques in the entrance hall, how much they gave as tax to local government. Wow, I couldn't believe that, because in the UK, and certainly in Eastern Europe, nobody respects the idea of a company paying tax to government. And if there was any money left over, then it would go into projects in the locality. Okay? It's a good quote there about after-tax profits generated, reinvested back, and used for local public expenditure. So it became a success story, very big success. By 1995, half of the total value added was coming from the TVE sector. 23 million TVs employing 135 million workers, half of all exports registered by TVEs. They were able to, I mean, you remember in the 70s, if you wanted something really cheap that wouldn't last, it was possibly Japanese. Japanese cars. But in the 80s, oh God, it's made in China, it won't be any good. But they soon moved up the value chain and the technology chain, and they started to make things which were not world-beating, but for the price were very good. So things started to develop, and as Peter Nolan said, collectively on the TVs became the key to prosperity. And interesting that Deng Xiaoping admitted they had no role in this. They didn't know what was going to happen. There was no planning from the top. Anything that I or any of the other comrades had foreseen, it just came out of the blue. They had no idea that local governments would be so proactive and innovative. And this is not an achievement of our central government. So this is very clearly nothing to do with the centre, all to do with local. A very quick one, who financed them? They set up their own local government-owned financial structures. Urban credit cooperatives, rural credit cooperatives. Now they were like the TVs, there was a peculiar hybridity. They were owned by local government, but they had they were owned by the community, but local government basically managed them. Okay? So, sort of a bit of a hybrid structure.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay,
But
please.
who would pay, who would give the first capital? The community? How would that work?
Savings. So these were set up as cooperatives that were going to be development focused. Okay? So, but I mean, everybody knew they were run by local government. And one of the biggest attractions, because the peasants in those days, I mean, they did have surplus money and they wanted to save. What they didn't want, if I put my money into the local bank here, is it going to go to the north of China to try and subsidize the horrendously inefficient steel industry? And when they said, no, you invest here, you save here, we invest here. And that was the key to savings mobilization. So they started to mobilize savings, and as the TVAEs became more efficient, then people had more incomes, they saved more, you had the virtuous circle. So things really started to move forward. Now, in the 1980s, yes, young Fernanda.
But the federal government wouldn't give any money to the TVs?
I mean, they didn't, as far as I know, they didn't really have any role to play in it. I mean, they regulated them. They tried to avoid corruption because corruption happens everywhere. But they were not actually funding them. The central government was funding the 4 big state development banks.
Okay.
Bank of Agriculture, Industrial Commerce, you know, the 4 big state banks. So they were allowing local governments to, because they were doing a good job with the TVEs and these others, in a sense, they didn't have a lot of spare money, but they said, well, they're doing a good job anyway, why do we need to put that much in? I mean, they might have put some in, I don't know, but it wasn't a big aspect of the model. Most of the money that they mobilized was through local savings.
Were they allowed to issue bonds?
No, as I understand, that was way...
Local savings.
They just basically local savings. I mean, that's really all they and reinvested profit, you know. So, now what's interesting is that at some stage, neoliberals started to worry a little bit because how does this work? Hang on a second, the township and village enterprise is local government owned, but yet it's efficient. Well, that throws all our neoclassical economics out of the window. How can that be because we've always said the only efficient business is a privately owned business run by entrepreneurs. And yet the Chinese are saying these are very successful. Something is wrong here. How can we teach our students about this? So they invented something, and this was important to me because I was looking at this at the time doing my PhD in the UK, and what neoclassical economists said, well look, there isn't anything secret here. What these TVs are private businesses run by entrepreneurs, and they go to the local government and they buy a certificate to say they're actually owned by the local government, and they called it a red hat. So if you're an entrepreneur and you want to operate as a private business, you have to pay this money to get the red hat. And then you can call yourself a local government-owned business, a TVE, but you're actually a private business. So this was how neoclassical economists, some accepted it. Some people said, no, we don't understand quite how it works, but it works. Whereas some said, no, it can't possibly, because that would undermine a lot of neoclassical economics, so there must be a reason. But what was interesting is then, so when I was doing my PhD, I heard about these red hats, and they weren't really because I was studying cooperatives as part of local government policy. And so they're really just entrepreneurial businesses. So I was a bit confused. But then in 1993, under Jiang Zemin, things changed. And he announced to the world, to the surprise, we're going to have a socialist market economy. Okay? And the TVEs, he said, we should start to get rid of them. Okay? Liquidate them. Convert them into private businesses. So hang on a second. The people who promoted the red hats said they were already private businesses. So how does that work? And of course, it worked by just omitting, ignoring everything you've written about TVEs before. Just like in Orwell's memory hole. That writing never existed. And so the literature very quickly turned, we've got to privatise the TVEs. They've got to be much more efficient as private businesses. So they completely forgot the fact that for 10 years they've been saying that they are private businesses. They're owned by entrepreneurs. Now they said, no, they have to be privatised. And so they were very quickly privatised. Sold off to their managers, naturally, well-connected local politicians and investors. And that was the beginning of the rise of stratospheric inequality in China. You can date it to when they sold off the TV population to small numbers of people who then made enormous amounts of money. And of course, the urban credit cooperatives and the rural credit cooperatives were privatised. The rural credit cooperatives were turned into, were either cut down or converted into for-profit businesses. UCCs were privatised or turned into city commercial banks with shareholders and investors and no particular development mandate. So China's financial model was obliterated. Okay, very quickly, the LDS model was the reason for China's success, so that's accepted. But during the time this was building up, obviously neoclassical economists, particularly in the US, were getting a little bit afraid about this because, hang on a second, China is developing very rapidly with heterodox model. We cannot allow this to carry on because other countries in Latin America or Africa might say, well, hang on a second, maybe the Chinese model is what we want. So we have to have a different dog in this fight. We cannot support the LDS model. We've got to support a more capitalist model. And that's where the Wenzhou model comes in. So Wenzhou was a city on the west, which always had a very strong capitalist tradition because it was trading, it was on the sea, trading with Taiwan, trading with East Asia. And the people there had a different idea. They said, we're going to have a more, they didn't say neoliberal, but we're going to have a more free market model. We'll leave businesses to do what they want. If they need money, other private people will supply that money. So we'll just have a very minimal state, and we'll just let the private sector, according to Adam Smith, will do all the magic of the market. And so Wenzhou became the sort of center of bottom-up capitalism in China, competing for attention with the LDS model. So you can imagine the people who supported the Wenzhou model were the US government, the World Bank, neoclassical economists in the US. Wenzhou model, when I was doing my PhD, I looked into the Wenzhou model, don't understand it, I can't figure out what's going on. So it was very much, if any of the TVEs were genuinely red hat, it was in Wenzhou. They were really private businesses, but just pretending to be TVEs. That's where the whole red hat thing had some meaning, nowhere else really. No state planning, no local industrial policy, no effort to provide finance, and light touch regulatory, jungle law. So this was a local neoliberal policy model. They didn't call it that then, but it was basically the West's preferred model of development for China, which they could possibly sell on to Africa or Asia or Latin America. And initially, the Wenzhou model thrived because all these entrepreneurs started to produce things for some of the bigger companies around the region. They began to specialize in certain things and they got into the supply chain. However, then things started to go wrong a bit. There was a lot of counterfeit branding because no regulation, so people were making Levi jeans and televisions with fake brands on and stuff like that. But a new entrepreneurial class begins to develop in Wenzhou. And the problem they had is they had all this money and they said, should we reinvest it back in moving up the value chain with our existing businesses, or should we speculate? And they chose to speculate. And so they started to move into things like housing, construction, providing credit to other people, and doing all sorts of things like that. They create, and of course, whenever you speculate, you always get a boom initially. So there was a boom, and it looked again as though Wenzhou's doing great. I mean, there's a huge boom going on there, and for a time, people were recommending the Wenzhou model to Africa, to Latin America. But of course, as every boom starts, there also has to be a bust. And when these entrepreneurs refused to reinvest their gains back into upgrading their technologies or innovating, but said, I'm going to open a casino, I'm going to open up a credit bureau and sell microcredit, I'm going to speculate on the stock market, which was just starting, then everything really went to pot. And by 2010, the whole thing collapsed. Okay? Whole thing collapsed. All that initial accumulation of capital was gone, and out-migration, corruption, suicides, the whole lot. And in March 2012, Beijing had to intervene to say, you have got to stop that. We are going to impose the model everywhere else, the LDS model, on Wenzhou. Okay? And so the Wenzhou model really is part of history. So, nearly the final one. So, the important thing in China then is this initial experience with the TVEs provided the local governments and city governments with expertise, with experience, with knowledge of how to do development. And so in the 1990s, when they needed to move up again from low-cost, cheap plastic things sold through Hong Kong, this is where the cities came in. The cities said, right, China needs a motor vehicle industry, because we can't keep importing cars from America. So a couple of cities started to move. By far the best, well, this new model was called directed improvisation. In other words, they would try to see where they could have a competitive advantage or build a competitive advantage at the city level and move into that. So they started this new model. The cities took the lead. In some examples, they were moving into construction, shipbuilding, IT, medicine, white goods, engineering, finance, all done at the city level. Maybe a little bit of help from the centre, or just keep the central far back, but all done at the city level. And central government provided a regulatory environment which was sufficiently robust that nobody really could do any dirty things or too much. And it opened foreign markets for these new products that started to come out. For example, in motor vehicles, in ships, they needed an open market, and this is where central government's negotiation to get into WTO counted really well. Shanghai is the example. They wanted a motor vehicle industry, so the city, through all its institutions, basically put everything in place. They brought the technology in, they got the education in, the training of the workers, they needed an SME population of suppliers. So they worked hard to build their capacities, buy the technology from abroad, and they basically built a motor vehicle industry from scratch. Okay? And it's one of the most efficient motor vehicle producers now in the world, in fact, but certainly in China. And it really was all because of the coordinating and proactive intervention of the city government under the mayor at the time, who was Jiang Zemin, and because Shanghai was so successful, that's how he got the top job a few years later. And it also, Beijing tried the LDS model a little bit, but not quite as robustly. So they said, well, we're not going to try and help SMEs, maybe they'll come up of their own accord, according to Adam Smith, they'll sprout up, we don't need to plan them, but they didn't. There was too much risk at stake. You don't really invest in something when it's risky. You might integrate into the motor plant, but maybe you won't. So maybe I should just buy a house and rent it out. So they didn't do quite as well. So Beijing's motor vehicle had to go down a different route. They had to invite foreign suppliers in and all sorts of other issues, which diluted the local developmental impact of the motor vehicle factory they had there. So you can read that. Yeah. So, after Shanghai's success, all the cities around China were trying to emulate that model. Powerful city administrations, putting everything in place, the education, the innovation, the foreign contacts, the teaching institutions, the technologies, everything they helped to coordinate, flexibly coordinate. This wasn't central planning like Russia, but a very proactive, very professional bureaucracy doing the development job. And so that's the reason why they got them into industries which are now world leaders. For example, solar was developed in 2 cities by local government, working with some technologists at universities and technology institutes, funding them, buying their first product, which was not very good, but it at least meant that they could learn how to make it. And then now China controls, I don't know, 60% of the world's solar market. Same with wind power. Same with transport. Every electric motorbike now is Chinese, I think. Then again, the policymakers got a bit afraid. And especially the ones who got trained, as a lot more Chinese economists are now, they're trained in the West, and they come back with these ideas. But our professor at Harvard told us the state should leave this alone and everything would work much better. And so China again started to flirt with the idea of maybe we should water down this model of local state intervention. And it looked as though the LDS model was really, they were dismantling parts of it and saying, no, cities shouldn't really educate the workers, leave that to the private sector. Universities shouldn't be about developing technologies, that should be a private sector. That should be a private sector job. We'll leave that all. The universities can charge students so that we don't have to pay for them, and they'll still develop technologies. Of course they will. So they started to dismantle the model. But it then came to a bit of a halt in 2008 because the very model all these Chinese students who studied at Harvard had said to the Chinese government, we need stock markets, we need to do what Wall Street's doing and building a great economy. Of course, all that ended, and that was a huge shock to the Chinese when that happened. They had most neoclassical economists didn't know it was coming, but Chinese policymakers didn't know it was coming. And they were in a real difficulty because they were starting to move towards the financialization model as on Wall Street, and then all of a sudden the whole thing blew up. So the Chinese government were like a rabbit in the headlights. What the hell do we do now? And all they could do was the biggest bailout of the economy of anyway, even bigger I think than the United States, because they were so afraid that their economy would go downhill and they'd have another Tiananmen Square. So that was what was the latest one, and so I mean today there is now, once they've got over the impact of 2008, they now realise that then the neoliberals come back in again and say, well, you know, we need to step back a bit and allow animal spirits, creative spirits to flourish again. And particularly in China's IT golden triangle in the south, they're now allowing lots of experimentation and all sorts of things to do. Often with the help of the city administration. But then instead of, say, keeping shares in these companies that you've taken the risk on and you've invested in, they sell them, give them to the private sector. So that's a bit of an LDS model, but not quite. And so euphoria started to build again in 2015, 2016, with all these big companies, Alibaba, Tencent, all these huge companies with their big stock market flotations. And then they were so powerful, they demanded deregulation so they could go everywhere. And that really created a bit of a problem for, as I said, Wall Street crash created havoc. That was initially, so I've jumped ahead of one of the slides. So the LDS model was slightly dismantled, but the key thing was that later on, when they started to move back into these new models of development in the southern states that seemed to develop heavily, that seemed to build into animal spirits, make use of animal spirits, then they were having problems later on because these models then started to run into the sand. I think that's the next one. Okay. So those models started to run into the sand. Yeah. So we have, for example, there was, we call it peer-to-peer lending. So some business in northern China will lend to businesses in southern China through the internet. All they want to know is they have an algorithm that decides whether you're a risk, they have your social media presence, and they don't even need to know your reputation or anything like that. And they lend you more money. And this became the way that small businesses were funded in China for a while. But then the defaults began to rise because people started not to pay back because you're in the south, this thing's in the north, oh, I won't pay. And so they started to get huge amounts of defaults, and so China then said, right, the P2P market closes. They lost something like $400 billion in 1 year. In 2019, they just closed it. They closed the market. And there's other areas. Local government is massively in debt at the moment because the Chinese central government pushed on them to go out and lend money, create new money, lend money, and then push it out into the community. But they watered down their LDS model, so they didn't really know who to lend it to. And so a lot of it was wasted. They gave it to entrepreneurs who built high-rise buildings that have never had a tenant. They couldn't sell any. The whole parts of Shanghai are just empty blocks for mile after mile after mile. The money given to them as part of this bailout program after 2008. So it's a very fluid situation at the moment. And so we need to know, so I don't know how it's going to go, but it certainly is very fluid at the moment. Okay, 5 more minutes, final record. So what did the Chinese get right? Okay, well, they basically developed a system of support for the right enterprises. The registered ones, the operating at minimum efficient scale, on the technology frontier, innovation skills driven, not low wage driven, horizontally and vertically networked and cooperating, and able to develop new types of ways of doing things through learning by doing, through experimenting. Those are the enterprises that an economy needs to grow. And they avoided wasting their money and their time and their institutions on the wrong type of businesses, which are through, such as microcredit, small micro-enterprises, unregistered, no real productivity enhancement, they're just people selling avocados on tables, operating at a very low scale, so there's no economies of scale, low technology, if any technology, driven by low wages, no bonuses, no commitment to health and safety, no concern for the environment, and mainly just trade-based, buying something for cheap and selling dear. So they avoided that. They avoided what you might call the African model of development. Okay? Because that is, in a nutshell, is the African model of development. That's the sort of businesses they have promoted over the last 20 or 30 years with the international development community's help. So that's one of the key reasons why they haven't developed. So will it end well? Who knows? The model replaced the developmental state model, so we'll see. It has many advantages, not just economic, but social, cultural, environmental, and political. It can be part of a progressive development movement, which is why I'm interested in it, because I don't just see it about economic development, but especially when you go to northern Italy, you realise how the local state basically can enhance everybody's freedom by providing kindergartens for everybody. Everybody who has a child has a kindergarten place. That is enormously liberating, extending your freedom. So local institutions that are part of our community can extend our freedom. Neoliberals think that governments actually restrict our freedom. I don't believe that at all. It can extend our freedom. So China, as the low LDS model par excellence, used the LDS model to good effect. But in recent years, that model is being diluted as the influence from the West, a little blip around 2008, but it's being pushed down a little, and particularly with the latest model, problems to do with fintech, financial technologies, and the huge problems they're having. We'll have to see how the LDS model fares over the next couple of years. So I'm very sorry, I really ran through that a little bit, too much. You can get the PowerPoint from Fernanda, or give me just email me on that one. And if you want to get anything else, I've written a few things on the LDS model. I think you sent them around anyway. But you go to the research gate, I'm posting stuff up there. And as of next year, I'm starting a book contract with Rutledge on the local origins of national economic success. So I'm really getting into it next year. And so I'd value any thoughts, any discussion as I'm starting to build up the evidence based on that. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Milford, for bringing this important issue that for sure we overlook it. And what's strange, because Brazil has such unequal regional developments that probably local development experience would be much important to enhance our development. We are more focused on the national development plans, and the idea that we got from China that the success comes from the centralized planning, you see, and very little have heard of local development, state intervention, and the importance of this in building the progress of China, development of China. So thank you very much. And I hope it stimulates people to think about local development because definitely that is an important issue that should be at the top of our agenda. So, questions?